Sorry, my phone was acting up. Okay, we're gonna knock this video out. We're gonna cut it off at the hour 17-minute mark. But this is part 5 of Misquoting Jesus in the Bible. This video is sponsored by Mohamed. He donated to the channel, sponsored the video. You can C-A-N-D. You can also teach me how to speak English, and then you can donate to the channel and sponsor a video as well. You can donate through the thanks button. Just request a video. Boom, there you go. You can also, if you don't want to do that, subscribe to the channel. If you don't want to do that, just give me a thumbs up. That helps. Okay? Let's go.
Possible exception of Matthew 24, where Jesus says, oh, not even the Son knows. None of the textual examples that...
I'm going to go back because I just paused it as this new question was being posed. So I want to make sure we get the whole question.
Says, yes. With the possible exception of Matthew 24, where Jesus says, oh, not even the Son knows, none of the textual examples that you've given tonight pose any problem for fundamental Christian doctrines. And I'm wondering if there are textual examples that are more threatening on that front. My second question is, to what extent were canon and textual problems discussed at Nicaea?
Okay, the second question is quite easy. To what extent were canon, the formation of the canon of the New Testament and the text of the New Testament discussed at Nicaea? The answer is not at all.
So, the Da Vinci Code says they were, so
yes.
Who should I believe?
Yes.
Did he really just say the Da Vinci Code? The look on his face right now is, if this building caught fire, I'm not going to run out. I just want to be taken right now.
Right. I think you need to trust Dan Brown. He did a lot of research for this book. He learned, for example, that Leonardo's name was really Da Vinci. Yeah, you know, according to the Da Vinci Code, of course, the Council of Nicaea is where there was a vote on whether Jesus was the Son of God or not, and it was actually a close vote. And that is completely bogus. Everything he says about the Council of Nicaea is absolutely wrong. The Council of Nicaea didn't talk about the formation of the canon, which books would go in, which books would go out. Constantine had no role to play in that decision at all, nothing to do with it, so far as we know. So that's just... you know, that's something he came up with that is no bearing on historical reality, I think. Are there textual changes that affect Christian doctrine? Well, it kind of depends how you look at things. There certainly are passages that affect Christian doctrine. There are passages in which scribes changed passages to emphasize that Jesus was divine. They changed other passages to emphasize that he was human. And so they wanted to emphasize that he was both human and divine. And so they changed passages so that it would look that way. One passage in particular is kind of interesting that is directly related to Christian doctrine, is that the doctrine of the Trinity is not explicitly taught in any passage of the Bible. In other words, the doctrine that there are three gods... Sorry. Dan Brown speaking once more. The doctrine that there's one God manifest in three persons, that these three persons are each individually completely God, but there's only one God. Not three gods, but one God, but not one person, three persons. So the three in one. This is not taught in any passage of the Bible except 1 John chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, in which the author says that there are three witnesses in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. That's That's a pretty explicit statement about the Trinity. Now, there's an interesting story about this passage because it doesn't show up in the Greek manuscripts of 1 John. It's in the Latin manuscripts of 1 John. When the first scholar to put together a printed Greek New Testament produced his work, this was Erasmus, who was a humanist from Rotterdam, in the year 1516. He put together for the first time the printed edition of the Greek New Testament. He didn't include the verse, because it wasn't in the manuscripts that he had. And the Latin theologians went ballistic. And according to the story that circulated, Erasmus said, look, it's not in any of the Greek manuscripts. And they said, yes, but it's part of the church's doctrine. You've gotten rid of the Trinity. And Erasmus said, look, if you can produce a Greek manuscript that has it in it, I'll include it in my next edition. And so they produced a Greek manuscript. And so they copied out a Greek, somebody copied out a Greek, and when they got to that point, they translated the Latin back into Greek, stuck it in, and Erasmus was true to his word and included that in his next edition. And it was on the basis of that edition that the King James Bible translators put the Bible into English. So that's why the verse showed up in the King James translation. So yeah, that certainly affects doctrine. Now the thing is, you could argue the doctrine of the Trinity without that verse. You can argue theology without any particular verse, because theology is never just kind of rooted in a particular word or it's a bigger thing than all that. And so my view is that Christian doctrine isn't based on any of these textual variations. What happens, though, is these textual variations sometimes change the way what a verse means. Sometimes they affect what an entire chunk of a book means. Sometimes these textual changes affect the very meaning of an entire book. And that's theologically significant to me. Not that it necessarily changes anybody's precious doctrines or their chosen doctrines, but it does affect what the books of the Bible mean, and that's theologically significant, I think. Yes?
Yes, I appreciated your lecture. I haven't read Misquoting Jesus, but I enjoyed your Da Vinci Code book last year. It was got me thinking. Seriously, I did like it a lot. A question I have regarding the attempts to harmonize the crucifixion accounts, whether they can be harmonized or not, concerns the logical approach that's appropriate to use, and this is what I'd ask your comment on. Aristotelian logic basically indicates that omission is not necessarily a contradiction. At the Stanford philosophy website, I think it's the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, I forget exactly, there's a very elegant summary of Aristotle's definition of a contradiction. Basically, in my limited style, I'll just say it's a situation where you have two statements that cannot both be true at the same time regarding the same situation. The statement that Bart, Ehrman, and Bob Gregg are in this room does not contradict the statement that Bart is in this room. It does contradict the statement that only Bart is in this room. So when you add the word only, that's a concern. And so given the fact that the gospel writers were not attempting to be exhaustive, as long as Mark doesn't say the only thing Jesus said was Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, I'm not sure that there's an issue there. It's like if there was a traffic accident. One witness might say, well, the red car swerved and hit the pedestrian. Another person might say, well, actually, before that, it was a blue car that cut the red car off that I saw that hit the pedestrian. But there's not, they'll have different details, but the test, the threshold for saying it's a contradiction seems to me to be higher than what you're setting it at.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, thank you. It's a very good question. And I think, part of it, there are a couple things to say about it. One is, it depends what you're after. If you're after what each witness is saying, then it's not fair to make the one witness say what the other witness is saying, because they're saying different things. Absolutely. And so if what you're interested in is what the witness has to say, then you have to stick with what that witness has to say. Right. There are problems. There are problems of reconciling things, because if you go with the idea that omission isn't a contradiction, the way you end up reconciling things leads to some very peculiar situations. For example, when I was in college, I bought a book. I was an evangelical Christian who held this kind of view, and I believed that, in fact, the texts could all be reconciled with one another. And I bought a book that was called The Life of Christ in Stereo. Which was, the idea is, it's kind of stereophonic sound with the Gospels, and you need them all going at the same time to get the full thing. And so, but there are problems, because in Mark's Gospel, Jesus tells Peter that before the cock crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times. Now, in Matthew's gospel, it says, before the cock crows, you'll deny me 3 times. So what do you do in the life of Christ in stereo? Well, you put the two together, and it ends up that Peter denies Jesus 6 times. Once before the cock crows, and once before it crows twice. Now, that's perfectly possible, and it reconciles the difference, but it makes the text say something different from what any of the texts say. And as it turns out, there are flat-out contradictions, too. Which your way of doing it wouldn't work, in my opinion. Just give you one example. One example is, well, no, never mind. Okay. What day did Jesus die on? Well, it depends which text you read. In Mark's gospel, it's quite explicit that Jesus has a Passover meal with his disciples. Mark 14:12. Where do you want us to prepare the Passover for you? Jesus tells them. They go home that night. They have the Passover meal. They eat the meal. After the meal, Jesus is arrested. He spends the night in jail. Next morning, appears before Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate kills him the morning after the Passover meal is eaten. You read the Gospel of John, and Jesus has a meal with his disciples. It's not called a Passover meal. He's arrested after the meal, spends the night in jail, shows up for Pontius Pilate, he's condemned, and it says that he is sent off to be crucified just after noon on the day of preparation for the Passover, which is the day before the Passover meal is eaten. So, he couldn't die both times. He either died the day before the Passover or the day after the Passover, but it couldn't be both. And so you have that kind of thing as well as the kind of thing you're pointing out where, they might just be eyewitnesses telling different parts of the story, in my opinion.
Just to clarify, though, using the Aristotelian definition of a contradiction, are the statements, in fact, about what Jesus said from the cross, are those contradictory, those accounts? Or are they? See, I was saying
You're just
omission
talking about the statements. No. But I'm saying that if you want to reconcile them by giving the 7 last words of the dying Jesus, if all you're interested in is Aristotelian logic, then the answer is no.
Okay.
But if you're interested in what these texts mean, then the answer is yes. You get very different portrayals depending on which account you read. So
Okay.
it depends what you're interested in.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
I was reading your book, Misquoting Jesus, today, and it actually made me think a lot of some feminist theory that I've been reading lately about the responsibility of academics. Bell Hooks took a lot of flack for this book, Feminist Theory from Margins to Center. And so I'm reading Misquoting Jesus and thinking this is essentially a book with an argument about philology that is accessible, readable, and does not sacrifice the complexity of the argument. So one, as an aspiring academic, what's your secret? And 2, do you have a philosophy about what our responsibility as academics is, and how do you think about who your audience is?
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you for the compliment. And, the reality is that most academics don't know how to talk to a normal human being. And so I have friends who want, they want to write a book that would sell in Barnes and Noble, and you have to tell them, you're not writing this for the guy who's in the office next door. You're writing this for your mother. You've got to think about, who you need to learn how to communicate with people, and so there's not an easy.
Know your audience, because your audience isn't necessarily going to be so ingrained with everything that you're saying. So you're going to have to say it in a dumbed down version, in a way, so that you can keep them on the path following what you're saying. If you just throw it out there as though he's talking to another peer, then everyone else is going to read it and think, that was really good. I don't know what I read, but I think it was really good. I'm not quite sure anymore. Maybe it wasn't. I have no idea. Then they're going to question everything because they're not going to understand it coming from your professional mind. That makes sense.
Answer to that, but that was absolutely the challenge of this book. One thing people have gotten upset about, evangelical scholars have gotten upset about this book, is they say, well, this isn't news. We've known about this for hundreds of years, which is, of course, what I say in the book. We've known about this for hundreds of years, so I'm not trying to present something that is like radically new that scholars have never known before. Scholars have known this since John Mill in 1707, and so this is old news, but nobody's bothered to tell the general audience. which is, I mean, and the reason they haven't bothered is pretty obvious. It's hard. I mean, we're talking about Greek manuscripts here. How do you talk about Greek manuscripts to people who don't read Greek? Right? Well, you just have to figure out some way to do it. So, the way I do is I like to tell stories. So that's how I decided to do it. So I don't think there's a real secret other than just learning how to talk to people. So, yes.
Actually, I have been reading the Bible for the last 5 years, and especially New Testament. There's one statement of Christ, be peace on him, which I want that you should explain it over. He says that I have been sent not to change the Torah. I have to come to fulfill it and act upon it in spirit and letter. And the only way to go to the heavens is if you follow Torah more than the rabbi. And then, if you read Torah, there's no mention about Son, Father, Holy Ghost. So when were they created? If they were from the very beginning, why didn't any of the old prophets in the Old Testament mention about it? So I just want to get this clarified.
Yes, thank you. Well, the passage you're quoting is from Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. It's distinctive to Matthew. Matthew's gospel is the one that emphasizes that Jesus' followers need to follow the Torah. It's interesting because the Apostle Paul says just the opposite. He says that a person can't be made right with God by following the Torah. And in Matthew, Jesus says his followers have to follow the Torah. And so that is an interesting issue. The question about what do you do about the fact that the Torah doesn't mention Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, of course, that's exercised theologians for centuries. Back when they were developing the doctrine of the Trinity, they had to deal with this. And they came up with solutions to that by modern standards, I think would be seen as creative. When God says, let us make man in our own image, who's he talking to? Right? Well, so there are passages that in the Torah that were used to support Christian theology, but of course other people might say, well, these are interpretations of the passage that aren't really the interpretations that they would have had for their first readers. Yes.
We're going to end it right there. We're going to go back 5 seconds just before he goes there. So this is part 5. And we will be back with the final video. 18 minutes. Minus whatever, ending video. So, all right, we're going to end this here. It's part 5. It's the Q&A. I don't really know what I'm contributing to on this, but still interesting to hear what he has to say. All right, so we're going to end it here. And until part 6, which will be out Monday. Apologize, but it is what it is. Until then, have a good day, have a good night, and have a good weekend.